Hello everyone and welcome back to Anomalous Archive, where we post scary stories to help you sleep. Please comment where you are listening to my videos from, since I believe it would be fun for all of us to know. Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. So without further ado, sit back, relax and enjoy. The prepared dinner from a couple of hours ago had already grown cold. Mary looked sadly at the set table. She had tried so hard for her husband, asked to leave work early, spent 2 hours slaving away in the kitchen, then spent a long time getting herself ready, and all for nothing. Stan usually got home around 7 in the evening, but at literally 6:45 p.m., he called and said he would be a little late. "Mary, I'll be there in half an hour, I swear," without a shadow of doubt on Evelyn. Mary believed him and waited, first half an hour, then an hour, and then she lost track of time. She tried calling him, but he wouldn't pick up. She knew she should pick up her fork and at least eat a little from her plate, but she couldn't. Her nerves were at the breaking point. From the outside, you might think Mary was simply tired, but tiredness had nothing to do with it. Why? Why are we the only ones living under the thumb of this monster? Why can't I behave normally in my own home? The girl knew that if she snapped, then everything would be ruined. That's how it was with Nina Parker and with the 38th apartment. That's how it was with Perkins, and she was no exception. 3 years ago, Mary bought this apartment. The price attracted her, significantly lower than market value. At the time, she thought the issue was the neighbors or the condition of the place, but no, it was something else. When Mary inspected the apartment before buying and realized that the place was in good condition and the neighbors were perfectly normal people, she kept pestering the seller about the real reason for such a low price. He mumbled something incoherent about evil forces and that he didn't want to live there anymore. After such an explanation, Mary barely hid her smile and decided to buy the apartment anyway. Why let a good thing go to waste? There are plenty of crazy people in the world, but this way I can get housing for practically nothing, she thought then, and now she cursed herself for that deal. Sitting in the kitchen, Mary remembered how her elderly neighbor, Nina Parker, had once told her, resigned, that she didn't have much time left in this world. Back then, Mary was lounging around with her friends all day and was lying on the bed, almost not getting up. When the doorbell rang, she immediately thought she wouldn't open it, but it rang persistently and insistently. Who can't sit still at home? Mary hissed angrily, yet she opened the door anyway, and all her aggression vanished the moment she saw her weeping neighbor. "Mary, can I come in?" "Yes, of course." "Did something happen?" Mary asked with concern as she let her in. "Oh, it did," the neighbor exclaimed and broke into sobs. Mary was at a loss. She didn't understand what was going on and why the neighbor came specifically to her. Nina Parker told her that she was grieving. Her son had died. She couldn't hold back her own hysteria, and by the time she came to her senses, it was too late. Mary was in shock from her neighbor's story and asked, "So what's the big deal? Shouldn't you be happy or something?" Nina Parker suddenly changed her expression and asked, "Don't you know?" "Know what?" "In that case, listen to me carefully. Every time someone in this building experiences grief, the faceless one comes." "Who?" "The faceless one. We call him that because he has no face. In place of his eyes, there are deep wrinkles, and in place of his mouth, a long seam. He doesn't speak and basically doesn't do anything, but he never comes for no reason. If you see him, expect trouble. Usually, he peeks into people's windows, and some of our tenants thought that if you cover the windows with curtains, he can't do anything. In vain. You can see him anywhere, in a basement window, from a bus window, or a car. The faceless one will still find a way to catch your eye." While Mary listened to her neighbor's story, she thought that the alcohol in her body still hadn't worn off. Wait a minute, what is this faceless one? Who does he come to? I don't understand anything, she said. The neighbor spoke about a creature with no face that appears to those who have suffered grief, and whenever its victims see it, they die. And there is no escape from death. Wait, so you're going to die too? Mary asked in confusion. Nina Parker sighed sorrowfully and nodded silently. I can't wrap my head around this. How can you avoid it? Mary asked. You have to try to keep yourself under control. It's horrible. I basically came to tell you that if anything happens to me, tell Lisa. She'll be looking for me. Your daughter? Yes. All right, Nina Parker. The retiree briefly said goodbye to Mary and went back to her apartment. Mary spent the next hour digesting the information she heard and then decided that it was all just the ramblings of an old lady. Her son died, so she lost her mind, Mary thought, and lay down on the bed again. However, she changed her mind when she found out the neighbor had fallen out of the window of her apartment. But Nina Parker didn't die immediately. She spent several days in intensive care. Sitting at the empty table, Mary remembered that story perfectly and understood she would have to ignore her husband's antics. It's nothing. I'm still okay. I'm fine. Nobody has died. So what if my husband has a mistress? Doesn't matter. We'll get through it, Mary thought. She declined dinner, and so the 2 full plates and the open bottle of wine remained on the table. Stan came home only in the early morning. He wasn't afraid at all of waking his wife, so he slammed doors, turned the water on full blast, and then, as if nothing had happened, lay down in their marital bed. Mary, meanwhile, had woken up. She saw a purple-violet bruise on Stan's neck and asked, "Aren't you ashamed?" "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about who?" "About Vicky." Stan sneered and said, "Well, I'm not to blame that Vicky isn't frigid like some people." Mary never expected such arrogance from her husband, so she instantly flew into a rage and, no longer able to hold back her tears, shouted at the top of her lungs, "Get out of here." "Out," I said. In her mind, an image of Vicky and Stan arose vividly, as if mocking her with visions of the lovers. Meanwhile, Stan made no move to calm her. He slowly, mockingly stuffed his clothes into his bags, all the while insulting Mary. At that moment, something changed in Mary's consciousness. She could no longer contain herself. She wanted to disappear forever, to fall asleep and never wake up. Mary sat in the corner of the bedroom, sobbing uncontrollably. She recalled all the moments when she and her husband had been happy, and there had been quite a few in their 5 years of marriage. Overcome with helplessness, she collapsed onto the bed and slept until nightfall. In the middle of the night, Mary awoke needing to use the bathroom. She grabbed her phone and, half asleep, made her way to the restroom. Still half dreaming, she returned to the bedroom and let out a piercing scream. There, in her window, stood the faceless one. He looked exactly as Nina Parker had described. Mary, horrified, realized that her days were numbered, and now she cursed herself for her weakness. The faceless one disappeared almost immediately the moment Mary looked at him again. Whether from the trauma or the weather, Mary fell ill the next day with a high fever. She called a doctor to the house and took sick leave. Lying in bed, she thought she would die from her illness. But time passed, and her condition gradually improved. She was able to go to the clinic on her own. The family doctor extended her sick leave until Monday. Mary walked home, looking forward to a few more days of rest. While walking, she got a call from her downstairs neighbor. "Hello?" "Mary, where are you?" the voice on the other end asked anxiously. "Not far from home." "Why?" "Well, you're flooding us." "I'll be there soon." Mary shouted and hung up. She realized every minute counted. She could either run home in 20 minutes, which was too long, or shorten the route. In winter, some people cut through by crossing the lake to get home faster. Without hesitating, Mary ran down to the lake and stepped right onto the ice. Once she was in the middle of the lake, she suddenly felt something was off. A crack sounded beneath her feet, and the next moment, the ice gave way. Mary understood that she had fallen through and, in a panic, tried to get out. But that only made things worse. Her body sank downward. She felt the cold literally burning her. Her legs went numb from the icy water, and she screamed at the top of her lungs, but no one answered. She screamed again and again, trying to escape, but all her attempts failed. Eventually, she ended up neck deep in water, and her body betrayed her, refusing to move. Mary flailed, grabbing at the ice, and soon she'd swallowed icy water. She began choking, and finally lost consciousness and sank to the bottom. When the news of his ex-wife's death reached Stan, he did his best to feign grief, though it wasn't easy for him. Inside, he was rejoicing. Now he'd finally have his own place and could bring Vicky there. "We'll call you back," the tired-sounding HR rep said and hung up. Kevin listened to yet another rejection and sneered in contempt. "Yeah, sure, call me back, definitely." He got up from the couch and headed to the kitchen. He needed something to snack on. In the fridge stood a lone pot of buckwheat and a single sausage in a bag. Kevin had left his previous job 2 months ago. Well, more accurately, he'd left because of health issues. He wasn't allowed to lift heavy objects anymore. For a month and a half, he'd been looking for a new job. At first, he thought it'd be easy, but he was wrong. The positions he liked never worked out. They always hired somebody else. People often offered him different work, even some that paid double, but there would always be physical labor involved, which he couldn't do. Others tried to lure him into shady deals, like going door to door peddling questionable cosmetics or miracle gadgets. "I'm fed up," Kevin shouted and slammed the fridge door. He looked at his half-empty pack of cigarettes, pulled one out, and inhaled greedily. He had to stretch each pack for 2 or 3 days now. Standing on the balcony, he watched a couple returning home with huge bags. He wondered what was in those bags and when was the last time he ate something he actually wanted, not just whatever was on sale. Kevin went into the hallway, quickly got dressed, and went down to the first floor. He checked his bank balance to see what he could afford, then headed to the liquor store. He bought the cheapest lemonade and the cheapest bottle of vodka. He wanted to forget about everything, how dire his situation was, how employers didn't care that his fridge was empty. He downed one shot after another, and soon his body relaxed. Kevin thought about calling someone, but realized it wouldn't do any good. "My parents are off on a bender again, and my friends have forgotten about me lately," he lamented. Kevin brooded about how unfair life was to him. He thought about how he was stuck in a dingy apartment he'd rented for pennies, how there was no food in the fridge, and how nobody would hire him. With each shot, his thoughts got darker. In the end, he broke down in sobs, loud, racking sobs, not caring if the neighbors heard. And at 11 in the morning on a weekday, no one was likely home anyway. He wiped his tears with his hands, smoked one cigarette after another, never mind that he'd have none left tomorrow, grabbed his hair in frustration, and raged at the Almighty for his poverty. Finally, drained, he lay down on the bed and blacked out almost immediately. Kevin woke up around 10 in the evening. It wasn't too late, but the entire day was gone. "I need to pull myself together. There's a whole week ahead of me. I have to go to interviews. Maybe I'll get hired after all." He went to the kitchen, brewed some tea, and soon was heading back to his room with the mug. Suddenly, he dropped the mug, scorching his leg. He screamed in a mix of pain and horror. There, Outside his window stood something with no face, only dark hollows where the eyes should be and a sewn-up mouth. Kevin figured he was just seeing things in his drunken state, but he still didn't want to stay alone with that creature. He ran into the stairwell and started banging on neighbors' doors. "There's some freak outside my window. Help, open up," he screamed at the top of his lungs. Nobody on his floor responded, so he ran down one floor. Same story. Finally, someone from one of the apartments answered. A frail elderly voice came from behind the door. "Boy, run away from here, pack your things, and run as fast as you can." "Let me in," Kevin shouted, pounding on the door. The place fell silent. He realized they wouldn't open. His choices were to spend the night in the stairwell or go back to his apartment. He stayed in the stairwell for about an hour until the booze wore off. With shaky legs, he returned to his apartment, but there was no one at the window anymore. Must have been the liquor, he concluded, and collapsed onto the bed. Kevin slept until about 1 in the afternoon. He stretched out in bed, scrolled through some posts on social media, then finally got up. He was nursing a hangover. Maybe I should take a shower, he thought, heading to the bathroom. The cool water did wonders, waking him up and lifting his spirits. Right now, I'll get out of the shower and find the right job, Kevin decided. He turned off the water and lifted one leg over the tub's edge. But the other leg lost its footing, sending him crashing headfirst onto the tiled floor. A red patch of blood quickly spread beneath his head. After some time, he came to but couldn't even stand. His body wouldn't obey, and he couldn't gather his thoughts. He kept feeling nauseous, and everything swam before his eyes. His tongue refused to move. At one point, he started to vomit. The vomit blocked his airway, and soon Kevin choked to death on it. When the 10th of the month came, Val Henderson was beside himself with rage. He knew Kevin had lost his job, and he knew that Deadbeat wouldn't be able to pay rent, but Kevin had managed to talk Val Henderson into not canceling the lease and giving him until the 5th. That day had passed, and there was still no payment. The man had gone easy on him, but regretted it. That scoundrel probably ran off somewhere. "Oh well, that's not the real issue. As long as he hasn't emptied out my place," he grumbled to himself as he approached the familiar building. He rang the doorbell for a long time, but no one opened up. So he pulled a key from his pocket, muttering, "All right, you parasite, now you'll get it." While he fiddled with the lock, the door across the hall opened. "Oh, Val, what are you doing here?" asked Svetlana, who lived in the apartment opposite. "About to evict that rascal. He's late on rent, plus he doesn't pick up the phone," he answered. The smile vanished from Svetlana's face. She sighed heavily. "He hasn't been seen lately, and the faceless one came to him," she said. Val Henderson looked taken aback. That means... I don't know. But you better check the apartment, just in case." He did go in and found Kevin's lifeless body. He called the police and an ambulance, then locked up the apartment again. After that, he had no desire to rent it out to anyone else. Julia could not pull herself together after visiting the hospital today. She had learned that the baby she and her husband had long awaited was born sick, with an incurable disease, unlikely to live even to 20. Julia could no longer contain her emotions and locked herself in the bathroom, quietly weeping. She was afraid of angering her husband, because from the start, he had warned her he wouldn't tolerate scandals or hysterics in the house. "Remember, whatever happens, don't you dare cry, throw fits, or lose control. Got it?" "But why?" she had asked. Because you'll die," he had said, and left it at that. Once, when he was drunk, he briefly explained what was what, and Julia had nodded obediently because she loved him very much and wanted to indulge him in everything. During all the years they'd been together, she never threw tantrums, never cried over every little thing, and stoically endured their quarrels. But now was different. Now she simply couldn't contain herself. Well, who cares? Let him divorce me if he wants, she thought, stepping out of the bathroom. Dennis was in the kitchen having dinner. As soon as he saw Julia, he jumped up from his seat and dragged her back into the bathroom. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed at her. "You've got a death wish or something?" Julia couldn't take it anymore and yelled, "Don't you understand? Our child is dying, and you care more about my composure?" The man's eyes filled with tears. He whispered, "I forbade you from losing it not because I didn't want to see it, but because he'll come here soon." "Who will?" Julia yelled. "The faceless one." The word faceless jarred Julia's memory. 5 years ago, in this very apartment, she and Dennis had been drinking some cheap booze because they were both students and couldn't afford better. He got drunk faster than she did and told her a story about some faceless one. At first, she believed it, but then decided Dennis was just joking. As for tears and hysterics, well, Julia had always been a calm girl. She also loved Dennis dearly and didn't want to upset him. They'd lived together practically in perfect harmony, hardly ever fighting. And now she was a new mother, even though the baby's birth, normally a joyful event, brought enough reasons to break down. Julia wiped her face on her sleeve and said, "Wait, so it's true?" "It's true. Smith in 42 divorced, but before he left, Mary drowned under the ice." Coincidence? I've lived in this building my whole life. You wouldn't believe how many such coincidences there've been. My whole life, Julia repeated, lost in thought. But what about kids? They cry all the time. I don't know why, but that creature doesn't touch children, only adults. From that day on, everything changed in Julia and Dennis's family. They both fell silent, speaking to each other only when necessary. Dennis knew Julia wouldn't be around much longer, but he hung on as best he could. One night, Dennis woke to his wife's screams. She was in the corner, in hysterics. Tears streamed down her face, her hands shook, and her face was as white as a sheet. "Julia, what happened?" Dennis yelled, either grasping the situation or simply alarmed by her sudden outcry. "He's there, I saw him," Julia babbled, stammering. Dennis silently gathered her in his arms and laid her on the bed. Neither slept until morning. He held her close, realizing they didn't have much time left together. Early that morning, Julia got a call from her mother, who said she felt unwell. Julia told her she could come over at any time. Her mother ended up feeling worse, and so Julia spent almost the entire day with her. An ambulance crew arrived and offered to take her mother to the hospital, but the older woman refused. Julia knew her mom couldn't stand hospitals and would never go there unless it was absolutely critical. Julia stayed until late, and after making sure her mother had fallen asleep, she left. It was after midnight. Sure, she could call a taxi, but home was only about 20 minutes away. I've walked this route 100 times. What could possibly happen, she thought, hurrying along the dimly lit road. She was halfway there when a man blocked her path. He looked revolting and disheveled, and Julia yelped in surprise, stepping back. He stepped forward. Julia turned and tried to go back the way she came, but suddenly something struck her head, and she lost consciousness. She awoke in a gray, windowless room. She tried to stand or call for help, but couldn't. Her hands and feet were bound, and only a muffled groan came from her mouth. "Awake?" the man asked, stuttering a little as he entered the room. She recognized him as her attacker. In the light, she got a clearer look, his tangled hair, pale face, blue lips, pronounced strabismus, rotting stumps instead of teeth. A lunatic, Julia concluded, but said nothing out loud. He tore the tape from her mouth with a yank. "Let me go, you sicko. What the hell do you want? Good girls don't walk at night," was all he said before falling silent. But his actions continued. Julia screamed until she was hoarse. He saw off all her toes with a hacksaw. She passed out from the pain multiple times, but the man always revived her with smelling salts. When all her toes were gone, he looked at them and smiled, but he didn't stop. He went on torturing her. He shoved thick needles one by one under Julia's toenails. The pain was excruciating, and she arched her back each time she felt the dull needle pierce deeper and deeper into her flesh. It seemed like her heart might stop any second, but Julia held on, relatively speaking. The monster used a blowtorch to burn strange symbols into Julia's body, symbols only he understood. Then he put her feet in a basin and filled it with boiling water. Finally, she died of shock from the pain. Afterward, the killer cut off her head, collected some of her blood in a plastic cup, and drank it in one gulp. He believed the more blood he drank, the stronger he became. The voices in his head told him so. The next day, Sophia Anderson phoned Dennis to see if Julia had gotten home safely. "Well, I thought she stayed with you," he replied. "No, Julia waited until I fell asleep and then left. And I actually feel better now, imagine that." Dennis didn't respond, just tossed the phone onto the bed and shut himself in the bathroom, struggling not to break down. He understood clearly that Julia was gone, and if he lost control right now, he'd be gone too, leaving their son an orphan.